baby boomers. When we talk about boomers, we do so in a way that does not really open a dialogue or allow any space for actually interesting conversations. Extending that hand, finding really funny, humorous human olive branches to send towards boomers is always a really good idea. A big question that younger generations have when they interrogate the ways that boomers used up resources and subsequently tanked the economy, crashed the housing market, is when is enough for you people? What if enough is a fallacy that was given to boomers as children, which never came to fruition in adulthood for them? I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today I wanted to talk about one of the greatest switch-ups in history. No, I'm not referring to JoJo Siwa, but rather baby boomers. I wanted to continue this series on different generations, how they're perceived, their actual experiences, and how we can better communicate with them as marketers, and also I think just person to person, especially in the case of boomers. As young people, boomers were all about love and art and drugs and rock and roll and just disrupting the status quo in any way they could. I think a lot of the time when we talk about boomers, we do so in a way that does not really open a dialogue or allow any space for actually interesting conversations. It's always a lot of rhetoric around how cheaply they bought their houses, how venomously they seem to hate avocado toast, and also their complete lack of ability to successfully rotate a PDF. I think a lot of the times, especially when we're talking about our elders, we tend to think of them as these impenetrable forces that just aren't going to move or change. Like every generation after them is a wave, and they are a very stubborn cliffside. But recently, I was with a very dear friend and mentor of mine, and in a lot of ways, she's really lived out the boomer dream. She's got an incredible family, prolific and actually history-making career, and just sort of everything that boomers placed a ton of value on. But still, when we walk and we talk and we hang out, she encourages me to go out and find delight and joy in the world rather than commercial or career success. She is happiest when I'm doing something that makes me very happy. It's the same with most boomer friends in my circle, of which I probably do have an abnormal amount, but I found that a lot of them have changed greatly as they've come to the end of their careers and have started really looking at things in a different way, which has been so interesting for me to observe. It's almost like their priorities have return to where they once were as they've come to the end of their sort of career dominance in most workplaces. There's a bitterness to boomers, sort of a misunderstanding of sorts. As they hit middle-aged, as we all started using OK Boomer as a weapon against them, I think that we really isolated them. We stopped talking with them and rather started talking to them. OK Boomer is a full sentence which doesn't really hold any space for rebuttal from their end, and I think that just made them really angry. It would make me really angry, to be honest. But I do think of the boomers who spent their days protesting and kind of just getting high and hanging out at the bead store. And I know that they're still in there. And I also know that those values and that approach to life still exists within them, which I think is really interesting to consider everything that they have done. So who are baby boomers? Baby boomers are people who were born between 1946 and the mid-60s. They grew up in an era of great social, political, and technological change. They were born directly following the Second World War, and they grew up with parents who saw crazy stuff, came home, and just had kids. And a lot of them, a lot of kids. Hence the boom in baby boom. One benefit to being part of this generation is that as they grew older and they wanted to enact social change that reflected their values, they had the numbers to really make a difference in the world, which I think is really interesting. To me, when I think of baby boomers, the epitome of this era, the people I think of are obviously my friends, but also people like Carole King, Gloria Steinem, Jane Goodall, Billy Joel, I feel like captured the boomer experience better than anyone from an artistic point of view. I feel like all of those people just are pillars of boomer society, and really do represent, I think, that boomer dream and what they intended to be in the world as they got older. To explain some of the ways in which boomers show up today as consumers, I thought I'd do something really cool and current and fun and reference a comic strip published before they were even born. In 1913, Arthur R. Momand started a comic strip called Keeping Up with the Joneses. The Joneses were like a metaphorical neighboring couple. The Joneses have, and the Smiths have not, the other couple. A lot of these comics feature the non-Jones couple yearning over the items or the lifestyle that the Joneses have acquired. They clamor for the leisure time the Joneses enjoy, for the new appliances they've put in. They're constantly comparing themselves to this metaphorical neighbor. Mark Twain said a lot of things, some of them good and some of them kind of terrible, but he did write something I loved about this concept of keeping up with the Joneses, which was, the outside influences are always pouring in upon us, and we are always obeying their orders and accepting their verdicts. The Smiths like the new play. The Joneses go to see it, and they copy the Smith verdict. I think it's so interesting thinking about who the Joneses are to boomers, and how this concept of keeping up with the Joneses has really mythologized, I think, a lot of boomer culture. Basically, for us on the outside, it's a never-ending loop watching the Joneses and the Smiths. The Joneses have, the Smiths want, the Smiths have, the Joneses want, but it's kind of impossible to diagnose this when you're living in the dynamic itself. So really, yeah, what does this have to do with boomers? Are they the Joneses? Are they the Smiths? Somewhere along the lines, boomers went from being these peaceful, hippie, Woodstock-going, good hang people to being known as domineering forces of conformity and wealth hoarding, which is such an interesting tension in how they've gone from where they were when they were young to who they are when they're older. A lot of grief millennials have is around feeling like they are getting less than what their parents had, which is true from a lot of points of view. It's just a fact. So they had to put the blame on someone, and boomers do make the most sense. I think a big question that younger generations have when they interrogate the ways that boomers used up resources and subsequently tanked the economy, crashed the housing market, is that when is enough for you people? It's sort of the constant question we're asking them. Why are you so greedy? When is enough enough? But I'd like to argue that there is no enough. And what if enough is a fallacy that was given to boomers as children, which never came to fruition in adulthood for them? I think to understand boomers a little better and connect some of these dots, it's important to discuss hedonism. Hedonism is a school of thought which also predates boomers, and in fact, the aforementioned Keeping Up with the Joneses comic strip. Hedonism is a school of thought created by Aristippus, who was a student of your boy Socrates. I'm a big fan of Socrates. Maybe we'll do a separate pod on him. Anyway, the foundational idea of hedonism is that above all else, all of our goals in life are very simple: to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Aristippus didn't believe in saving money for a rainy day, in conserving today's pleasure for tomorrow's potential pleasure. He thought it was all about living in the moment, a true benefactor of YOLO, but doing so with the tools that you already possessed. So it's not about having less today in the hopes that that will pay off tomorrow. It's about going balls to the wall, crazy, having as good a time as possible, because tomorrow is not, in fact, promised. He really didn't subscribe to the idea that we must first suffer in order to gain pleasure in the future. That was just not his vibe. It's very 14th century from him, but the rise of religion and his own death put a pause on the adoption of hedonism from a philosophical and both theoretical and obviously psychological point of view. But then came Epicurus, who may be regarded as the father of sort of modern hedonism, of how we understand it today. But he started by first redefining the work that was already done, by redefining pleasure and what that meant in this theory. He saw pleasure less as a big night out at a Gatsby-style mansion. By the way, Gatsby reference is a nod to next week's episode, so stay tuned. But anyway, he believed pleasure was more of a state of peace and tranquility, which I tend to side with. It wasn't just about doing the most that you could do to have the most fun and letting things fall to the wayside. It was more about a contentment of being for him. He argued that you could simply look at a baby and really uncover that this is our true state. Babies know what is nice and what is painful, and they act accordingly. They really don't know anything but those two things. And so Epicurus thought of hedonism less of a theory to get buy-in for and more of just a natural state of being and a way to explain our actions in life by drawing it back to this very simple concept that we are doing things to come by pleasure and avoid pain. Yeah, it does make a lot of sense, and it does kind of account for a lot of behavior in people, but something that's quite interesting to me as well is there are different sort of fractions that I'm not going to get into today of hedonism. We can think about it from an ethical point of view, psychological. We can think about how hedonism helps guide our values intrinsically. There's a lot going on there, but for today's episode, just keeping it super simple, it basically just means doing things that are nice, that put us forward in that ultimate goal of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Super simple. I do love talking about philosophy, especially early philosophers, saying things that now are so commonplace, but back then it was like very exciting, very new, very cool. On another more personal note, I guess, I hate a treadmill. It's so incredibly boring and stupid to me to run on a treadmill and go nowhere. I like a view, I like a trail, I want to have a destination. And for the purpose of working out, moving my body, it's a really fine, normal value to hold. It is possible for me to always be going somewhere if I'm engaging in movement, like running or walking. But it gets very interesting, it gets very philosophical when we think, what about life? What about when we tie specific goals to pleasure? Are we going to find more peace and tranquility in life if we meet certain career expectations or manage to score a limited edition version of a product? You know, are there ways to sort of go with the flow and encourage different types of happiness and joy? This brings us to not a totally separate, but an interesting version of hedonism, which is a theory in psychology called the hedonic treadmill or hedonic adaptation. In general, do you have goals? Do you think about these goals? Do you think that they will elevate your sense of happiness in general? I think a lot of people tend to do that. It's like if I were to offer you an interview for your dream job that you've wanted your whole life, you get that interview, you bomb it, you don't get the job, they tell you to never come back, there's an assumption that that is going to really impact your happiness. While on the other side, you can think, if I give you that interview, you prep for it, you come totally prepared, nail it, out of the park, you get the job, you'd assume that getting that job would catapult you to almost a higher level of happiness. However, hedonic adaptation argues that the impacts on our happiness fluctuate a little bit more and a little bit less, but there is a general baseline of happiness that we all sort of return to. So obviously, when you get that job, you're going to get a spike in happiness and joy in your life that you will ride out for a while, but eventually you return to, again, this baseline of happiness and almost contentment. That baseline of happiness is actually going to be different for everyone. Research suggests that it's determined mostly by genetics and our own selves, obviously with a sprinkle of personal circumstances. In 1978, Brickman conducted a study which focused on the lasting effects of happiness in two extreme groups. Also, for reference, even just the idea of hedonic adaptation was coined by Brickman and Campbell in 1971. So, flash forward a little bit, doing a study to kind of prove these things out. Two very extreme groups. One group had recently won the lottery, while the other had recently suffered injuries that left them paraplegic. The lottery winners reported being similarly happy before and after the event, with an assumption that that happiness baseline would stay the same for the rest of their lives. It was exciting to win the lottery, but it didn't ultimately change their capacity for happiness and contentment. What's interesting is that on the other side, those who suffered the accidents felt that they were happier prior to the injuries that left them paraplegic, which makes a lot of sense, driven by nostalgia. And then they actually reported in the subsequent years that they felt they returned to that baseline of happiness. Both groups recognized and accepted that return to baseline happiness. There's also been interesting research to suggest that major life events and changes to our circumstances can lower someone's baseline of happiness, and it does appear to be a little bit easier to lower that baseline than it is to raise it. So a great example of this would be imprisonment, which a 2014 study showed to have long-lasting effects on our happiness baseline. So there are events in our lives which can cause that baseline to go up or down, but they're typically really big things that would have that kind of impact. So my hypothesis, to bring it back to boomers, is that they were put on this hedonic treadmill by a group of people who experienced real shifts in their baselines because of major life events and subsequent fallout to their personal circumstances. As most evidence shows that external life circumstances tend to affect those baselines on a more negative level, it does make a lot of sense that the silent generation, which came before the boomers, suffered so much because it was just really ass to be a human being back then. It wouldn't be totally wild to suggest that that generation had an incredibly low baseline of happiness. They were dealing with a lot of war, the literal Great Depression. It was not a good time. So they really did, in a lot of ways, take their bad deal, and they helped elevate that baseline for everyone in different ways. And boomers most likely saw this in their parents and thought that they would do the same. But times were just different for them, and it's not totally their fault. They were told and they saw modeled behavior that would suggest that there was such thing as enough, which brings us back to that keeping up with the Joneses and even hedonism as a whole concept. But boomers, I truly do believe, thought that there was a point in their life where enough would be enough, that they would know it when they found it, so they just kept looking for it. The original Keeping Up with the Joneses comics were, in fact, about the people who raised boomers. So again, it makes so much sense that they would have internalized this attitude in their quest to be happier and joyous and live life. Boomers as a whole kind of remind me of No Face from Spirited Away, sort of always taking, feared by most, but ultimately deep down looking to be freed by that. So like I said, back to Keeping Up with the Joneses, I started with the explanation of that concept and then sort of moved through hedonism and a lot of other things to tie together and give us all more context into how we should be looking at the effects that Keeping Up with the Joneses would have on boomers. I don't want to paint another really boring portrait of boomers of being jealous and greedy. I think I really wanted to represent the idiom to you and instead discuss how I think it's played out for them and against them in a lot of ways. Like I already mentioned, the main critique from Gen X and millennials has always been driven by the fact that they were the first generations to do worse than their parents in life. And it is so fair to be upset about that. But I think what has happened over time is that boomers have allowed that comparison to come back. But this time, it almost feels like it's between themselves and younger generations. They want it to be, in some ways, both the Joneses and the Smiths, which I think is very interesting. And I think we all can think of examples of this where boomers tend to seek to remind us how much harder they had things while also chastising us for not having as much as they do. They faulted particularly millennials personally for their own inability to keep up instead of acknowledging market conditions and social movements that did make things harder for millennials to keep up. There's so much competition in boomer culture, which I think is really interesting. And it's also very present in their sort of understanding of the world. It's always a us versus them position that they take, which again, very interesting. And I think very fueled by this internalized need to keep up with these metaphorical Joneses who don't exist and to reach that point of enough that also doesn't exist. I think that being unable to really shoulder some of the blame and critique, they've turned themselves into the Smiths almost permanently and really ostracized themselves from a lot of conversation. And like I said at the top, I think we do some of that by speaking about them so poorly, but I think it's definitely coming from sort of both sides. When I personally find myself targeting boomers now, I often hugely rely on humor, which surprises people greatly. But one thing about boomers, from a very tactical point of view, is that they are going to hit that meta comment section. They're all about leaving a comment and a reaction and tagging each other. And what is a more shareable piece of content than something that is funny? I think they particularly love to see brands riffing on social dynamics, specifically those that exist within families. The thing about boomers is they're fun and they're kind of lively, and like No Face, they would like to be freed. You just have to extend that hand and that help. As we discussed the Gen X need for value last week and the pull that millennials feel towards nostalgia before that, I think it's very interesting to note that oftentimes boomers are motivated by a potentially almost subconscious hedonism that is very tied to their youth. What was once praised in them, then they were scorned for, and now they're sort of being praised for it again, which is probably a very confusing journey. But I actually do find when working with brands where applicable, that boomers are my favorite segment to advertise to. We really align on just wanting to have fun while spending our money. They also, speaking of money, have money, which can't be ignored. Boomers have disposable income. We all get distracted sometimes trying to modernize brands and product offerings, which is a totally valid effort. But I do think sometimes it's worth considering how you might be alienating boomers and older demographics by making sweeping assumptions about what they want and what they don't want to purchase. I see a lot of really boring marketing strategies presented to me when we're talking about boomers, but I think we gotta remember that they're not their parents. A lot of them are like getting tattoos, being really cool. And I think we also have to remember what I was talking about at the top of the episode. It's just, they were so wild when they were younger, and they were so full of love and change and a need for connection that we don't really possess anymore. And so I think always extending that hand, and like I said, finding really funny, humorous, human olive branches to send towards boomers is always a really good idea. They were like crazier than any of us. Woodstock was wild. And they do still have that sense of humor. I think we just have to give them a chance when we are working to communicate with them. I feel like I could honestly talk about boomers for like an entire day, but I'll try to keep this a regular length for a podcast. But yeah, in conclusion, I think we don't give boomers enough credit for their humanity and their humor. And I think that that can be tied to some of the themes I laid out, where there is a real bitterness and almost frigid attitude that we perceive from boomers, which stems from this idea of having to keep up with the Joneses and having to find an enough, and there's never an enough. So I think internally for them, they do feel self-conscious about that, you know, seeing their parents do different things, not necessarily better, but live differently than them, I think greatly affected them. So again, it's all about when we're communicating with boomers, like putting that hand out there, reaching that olive branch out there, and having a good time, being really funny, being really weird, being really zany. I did lose a very good boomer friend of mine late last year, and he was also someone with a groundbreaking career and years of very public success. Again, an absolute case study and dream in sort of boomer life trajectory. When I was younger, I worked a lot and I thought that was really all that mattered. Building a career, being the best, winning the rat race and getting the most cheese, the usual. And I remember this friend of mine sat me down and told me that I was being really stupid, which I found quite shocking, as I believed I was on a very envious career trajectory at the time because everyone told me that I was. And I wrote this down back then in my diary because I remember it felt so important and it also felt so boomery, which is interesting considering a lot of the other PR that boomers get. But yeah, I'll never forget. He told me that just because I was smart and just because I was talented did not mean that I had to spend the rest of my life suffering a grueling work schedule and a mountain of responsibilities through that. He told me that really he had no regrets. He loved his life and his work and his kids and his family. But he also told me to try new things and to go to Australia, which I think is really funny because I now spend half my life there, as much as it pains me to admit how right he was. He told me to go to Australia because the beaches and the beer were so good for him. And he told me that the work always comes around, but life has a way of escaping from your grasp. So it's better to pay attention to how you're living rather than handcuffing yourself and your identity to your work, which is so profound and such meaningful advice. And again, I think when we're all being really real, such a boomer thing to say because they had the fun, they did that, they had the big full careers, they were able to do things from a economic point of view the rest of the generations that came after them could only dream of. And still, as they started closing out their careers, what they mostly, in my experience, have yearned for is sort of a return to that true form. Again, big philosophical episode, but I think the main takeaway is just when we are looking at boomers to not work off of the assumptions and the sort of persona that's been given to them by the rest of the world, rather listen to what they're saying, what they want, and find ways to connect with the sort of peak boomer culture that we all associate with them from back in the 60s and 70s and bring that into the future because that is sort of who they are at their core and they respond so well to it. That was the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I could talk about boomers forever. They've probably been the most influential generation on me in a lot of different ways. Hopefully you liked that episode. Next week, we will be talking about Gen Z, which is going to be really fun and interesting. If you haven't already, would really appreciate a rating and a subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And lastly, if you're still really not sure who you're even supposed to be targeting, reach out, let us know at Pilot House. We would love to chat persona strategy and figure out if boomers are even the right demographic for you. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you tune in next week.